Righto guys, so unfortunately the GoPro doing GoPro things had lost all the footage prior to this point. Basically just showing you the tail shaft getting taken out and getting ready to set up the puller to pull off the yoke. So with the puller only wanting to pull the outer ring off of the yoke and not actually pull the yoke off, we had to come up with a better idea. So what we came up with was a couple of bits of angle iron with a couple of holes drilled to be able to attach the pulley, and then also bolt the angle iron to the yoke on where the tail shaft bolts to, and then we tried pulling it off from there. So after trying that for a while, it wasn't working, and as you can see here, it was just bending the angle iron. Okay, so we ended up having to make a bit of a pulley system, right? So we started off with the one angle piece, and then that's bolted through, hang on, that's bolted through the yoke there, and then the puller on top, and then that was kept bending, so we end up welding another piece to it. Anyway, got it off, and that's, so now we can knock that seal out, clean it up, and then new one. So once we got that yoke off, it was time to knock the seal out. And then here you can see that seal finally came, and a little bit of oil came out with it as well, so make sure you have a drip tray underneath. With the yoke off, it's a good time to inspect that bearing for any damage and the shaft for any damage. So to install the new one, just get a little bit of grease, put a nice small thin layer all the way around the edge, just to help it slide in. And that is ready to go on. And then with the seal, you just use a hammer, hold that nice and even over it, and you just keep going round and round until it's fully seated in. Trying to keep it as even as possible so we don't get any kinks in it. I don't know if you could hear that on the camera, but when you get to a point that the seal, because it's got a steel ring around it, when it's hit the diff, it changes tone, goes to a higher pitch. And then you know it's on and all the way. Woo. And there we have the new seal installed. So now we're installing the yoke back onto the diff. And one thing I forgot to mention earlier was the nut that holds this yoke on isn't actually torqued, and what I had to do was count the amount of threads showing past the nut, and then also draw marks on it to show where it lines up from the shaft to the nut to the yoke, so that it all lines up, and I'll show you that in a minute. Like in theory, that's exactly where we are. So there's the mark there onto the nut, onto the yoke, and we are 2 threads deep on that part. So in theory, that is exactly where it come off. So now here, instead of putting the transmission into neutral and turning the tail shaft, you'll see me struggling with a breaker bar, trying to turn that nut to move the car so that I can get the tail shaft lined up. But I do realise in the end, put the transmission into neutral, and it was as easy as that. One thing to note as well, I did Loctite the main nut, and I also Loctite the bolts on the saddles holding on the tail shaft. Now if you're wondering why I'm squirting tomato sauce into the rear diff, it's not actually sauce. I just use it as a squeezy bottle for my diff oil. I find it the most simplest way without having to go and buy like a Tom Thumb or a pump sort of thing to fill the diff back up with oil. So it's now been about 3,000 k's since replacing the oil seal, and no leaks, happy days, no bolts have come loose. I've jumped under a couple of times now to check the bolts and the main nut, and everything seems happy days, so that's a win.